Hey everyone. Today we're going to talk about one of the most intense, exhausting, and let's be honest, slightly terrifying periods of my life, the Blitz. Those months when the skies over London roared with enemy bombers and the ground shook under our feet. I want to tell you what it felt like to stand right in the middle of it all, to look fear in the face and still get out of bed every morning to fight another day. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to my channel to support me making more great videos. And hey, wherever you are right now, whether it's early morning in New York, late afternoon in Sydney, or midnight in Hanoi, settle in with me. Now, let's listen to my compelling story in this video. When the first air raid sirens wailed, it was like London took one collective breath and didn't let it out for months. You're kidding if you think people just got used to it. No one gets used to hearing the ominous drone of bombers overhead. I remember standing in the war rooms, looking at the map lit with little red lights marking fresh damage, and thinking, every one of those is someone's home, someone's street, someone's life. Yet even in that chaos, there was no time to wallow. Every morning, I'd put on my hat, light a cigar, and make my rounds. People needed to see me, their prime minister, on the streets, in the rubble, shaking their hands. They needed to see I wasn't hiding in a bunker with a cup of tea while they were digging out from last night's destruction. I'd go into the shelters, duck under those low concrete arches, and talk with families. Some of them still had dust in their hair from buildings that had collapsed just hours before. Inside, I was just as worried as they were. My own home had been bombed. More than once, in fact. But if I let fear have the driver's seat, the whole country would feel it. That was lesson one in resilience. You don't have to feel fearless. You just have to act like it until the fear starts to listen to you. And let me tell you, acting calm in the middle of pandemonium isn't about pretending the danger isn't real. It's about refusing to give it more power than it already has. Every time I stepped outside and greeted a crowd, I was telling them without words, we're still here. We're still fighting. And so long as I stand, so do you. Of course, not everyone approved. Some of my advisors thought I was being reckless, walking around bomb sites when enemy aircraft could return at any moment. But leadership isn't about protecting yourself. It's about showing others how to keep going. If that meant getting a little dust on my coat, so be it. One night, after another heavy raid, I stood on a rooftop looking out over London. Fires dotted the skyline, smoke drifted through the streets, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, probably to signal more incoming planes. It was a scene from hell, yet in that moment, I felt strangely certain. If we can survive tonight, we can survive the next one, and the one after that. That's something I think people today can understand in their own way. Maybe your Blitz isn't a literal bombing. It's losing your job, facing a breakup, watching a business you built collapse. It's waking up to another day where everything feels uncertain. In those moments, the only way forward is to meet the day head on, even when your legs are shaking. During the Blitz, I learned that resilience is less about being naturally strong and more about practicing strength over and over until it becomes part of you. For me, that meant walking the streets when I could have been hiding underground. For you, it might mean sending that job application when you've been rejected 5 times already, or going for that morning run when every part of you wants to stay in bed. And here's something else. It's contagious. I saw it happen. One shopkeeper kept his storefront open every single day during the bombing. People would walk past and say, well, if he's still at it, maybe I can keep going too. Courage, just like fear, spreads quickly. The trick is deciding which one you're going to spread. There were nights when I'd go home, sit in the quiet, and let myself feel every ounce of exhaustion I'd been holding back. That's the part people don't always see, the private moments where you admit to yourself, this is hard. I don't know how long I can keep this up. But the morning always came, and with it, the duty to try again. Resilience isn't a one-time choice. It's a decision you have to remake every single day. And honestly, part of me found strength in knowing that the enemy wanted us to break. That was their real weapon, not bombs, but the belief that we would eventually give in. I couldn't let that happen. None of us could. Every time I stood on a street corner, every time I lifted my hand in greeting, I was making it clear. We're not folding. Even now, I think back to those nights and realize how much they taught me about handling pressure. Whether it's wartime London or your own personal crisis, the principle is the same. Don't let the chaos decide who you're going to be. When the bombs fell, we didn't just stand there trembling. We moved sandbags, we brewed tea, we put up blackout curtains. And in our own quiet way, we told the darkness it wasn't going to win. That's resilience. Not the absence of fear, but the stubborn refusal to let fear be the loudest voice in the room. If you can hold that line, even just for one more day, you'll be amazed how much further you can go. And that's what facing the Blitz head-on taught me. Not just how to survive, but how to keep living when survival seems like the only goal. Making hard choices when everyone's watching is a very particular kind of pressure, like walking a tightrope while the whole world holds its breath and waits for you to wobble. As Prime Minister during the war, that was my daily reality. And no matter how much tea I drank or how many cigars I smoked, the truth was, those decisions could never be taken lightly. Here's the thing. Everyone thinks they want to be in charge until they realize what that actually means. It's not just about giving speeches or posing for photographs. It's about signing your name to choices that could change or end thousands of lives. There's no pause button, no let's think about it next week. In war, if you hesitate too long, the enemy makes the decision for you. I remember one morning when the War Cabinet brought me intelligence about an impending German assault in a vulnerable coastal area. The options on the table were ugly. Option 1, divert ships and resources from another defense line, leaving that area exposed. Option 2, hold our current positions and risk losing the port. Both carried real consequences. Both could be criticized as reckless. I looked at my generals, my ministers, and the clock. We didn't have the luxury of a day-long debate. I made the call. Ships were redirected. Yes, it weakened another front temporarily, but we held the port. Later, I learned that if we'd lost it, the enemy would have gained a much easier route for their invasion plans. That's the thing about hard choices. You rarely get applause for the ones that save you, because the disaster you avoided is invisible. When everyone's watching, you have to project certainty, even if inside, you're wrestling with doubt. People aren't looking to see if you have all the answers. They're looking to see if you're brave enough to give an answer. A hesitant leader is more dangerous than a wrong decision. I learned that early, and it's a principle I still stand by. And here's something you might not expect. Making tough decisions isn't always about being bold. Sometimes it's about restraint. There were moments when the cabinet urged aggressive attacks, moves that would have made for rousing headlines. But I could see the traps. An early victory could drain our strength before the bigger battles. Saying no to a flashy opportunity can be harder than saying yes to a risk. You've probably faced your own version of this. Maybe it's choosing between two career paths, deciding whether to stay in a relationship, or making a call that could upset friends or family. In those moments, the temptation is to stall, to collect just a bit more information. But sooner or later, the clock runs out. The moment demands a choice. I used to remind myself of this. If you're the one in the chair, you're there to choose. That's the job. Delegating is fine, but avoiding the decision? That's a betrayal of the responsibility you've been given. One of the most difficult calls I ever made was to commit our Air Force to defend a key ally under direct assault, knowing it would stretch our pilots and aircraft to their limits. The safe option was to keep those resources at home. But I knew if we didn't act, we'd lose not just an ally, but the trust of every nation still willing to stand beside us. That choice paid off later in ways no one could have predicted. Because alliances, like trust, are built on the decisions you make when it's costly. I won't pretend I always slept soundly after making these calls. More often than not, I'd lie awake replaying the possibilities, wondering if there had been a better path. But the key to resilience isn't avoiding that mental weight. It's carrying it without letting it crush you. Here's what I discovered. Once you make the decision, you own it completely. No second guessing in public, no half-hearted follow-through. People can sense hesitation, and once they do, confidence erodes faster than a sandcastle in the tide. I made it my habit to speak about each choice with the same confidence I felt at the moment of decision, even if later I had my doubts. Sometimes the public's reaction was instant outrage. Other times it was cautious approval. And sometimes, months later, the very people who criticized me were the first to say, "It turned out you were right." But you can't lead based on the applause of the moment. You have to lead for the results that history will judge. In your own life, remember that the weight of a decision doesn't make you weaker. It sharpens you. You learn to trust your process, to consider the facts, listen to trusted voices, and then act. And yes, you'll make wrong calls. I made plenty, but the real failure is letting fear of being wrong stop you from deciding at all. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of war planning, I poured myself a drink and looked out over the Thames. The city was quiet for once. I thought about how many people were going about their lives without any idea of the debates, the arguments, the tense moments happening just a few hundred yards away in Whitehall. That's when it hit me. Leaders don't just make decisions for the people they see in front of them. They make decisions for people who will never know their names, who will never thank them, who will never realize how close they came to a very different life. So, when everyone's watching, or even when no one is, you make the call, you carry it, and you move forward because there's always another decision waiting tomorrow. That's the burden and the privilege of leadership. Turning setbacks into comebacks isn't a trick, it's a habit. If you live long enough, and especially if you lead long enough, you'll collect your fair share of humiliations. I certainly did. In fact, before I was the wartime prime minister everyone remembers, I was known, quite unflatteringly, as the man who had failed spectacularly. I'll be honest, my early political career was a bit of a disaster at times. I'd been blamed for military blunders, lost ministerial posts, and even spent years in the political wilderness where people thought my career was over. Oh yes, there were days when I was little more than a cautionary tale whispered in Parliament's corridors. One of the biggest blows came after the Gallipoli campaign during the First World War. I'd championed the idea, believed it could shorten the war, and watched it unravel into a costly failure. The backlash was swift and merciless. I was out of government, my reputation shredded. If social media had existed back then, I'd have been the world's top trending disaster for weeks. So how does one climb back from that? Well, here's what I learned. A setback is only permanent if you decide to stop moving. I could have slunk off into obscurity, taken up painting full time, and written bitter memoirs, but I decided instead to keep showing up. I rejoined the army, served on the front lines in France, and slowly rebuilt not just my public image, but my own sense of purpose. The truth is, comebacks aren't born from sudden strokes of luck. They're built brick by brick, in the small, unglamorous choices you make after you've been knocked down. It's sending that next letter after your first proposal was rejected. It's showing up to work the day after you've been humiliated. It's saying, well, that didn't kill me, so let's see what's next. By the time the Second World War arrived, I had already been through enough personal and political storms to know that losing once, or even several times, didn't mean you were finished. When the early months of the war brought defeat after defeat, I didn't crumble because I'd already lived through the feeling of public failure. I knew what it tasted like, and I knew it could be survived. I remember after the fall of France in 1940, the pressure on me was enormous. Many believed Britain couldn't stand alone against Germany. Some suggested negotiating peace. Now, I'd been in the position before where conventional wisdom said I was beaten. And I'd learned something valuable. Conventional wisdom is often just fear in a fancy suit. I rejected the defeatist voices and instead looked for every possible way to strengthen our defenses, rally our people, and keep the fight alive. Setbacks have a way of convincing you they're the end of the road, but I'd trained myself to see them as redirections. If the door shuts, find a window. If the window's locked, build a ladder. If the ladder breaks, grab a shovel and dig your own tunnel. The method doesn't matter. The point is you don't stay where you fell. Even in my personal life, I use this approach. I had health scares, financial troubles, and moments where my own family life was strained under the weight of public duty. But I treated each one like a temporary storm. Yes, you might get drenched, but if you keep moving forward, eventually you'll reach dry ground. I think this lesson applies to everyone today. Maybe you didn't get into the university you wanted. Maybe your startup failed. Maybe you've been rejected in love. The temptation is to believe the story is over. But as I discovered, the real story often begins after the failure. People don't remember you for falling. They remember you for getting back up. I used to joke that I had an allergy to giving up. Once I latched onto a goal, the only way I'd stop was if it was pried out of my cold hands. And even then, I'd probably find another goal to chase. This stubbornness, which could be quite irritating to my colleagues, is also what made comebacks possible. During the war, this mindset became a kind of national rallying cry. Every time the enemy tried to crush us with a bombing campaign or a propaganda push, we responded by patching up the damage and carrying on as if to say, "Nice try, but we're still here." That's the spirit of a comeback, not just surviving the blow, but sending a clear message that it didn't break you. And here's the best part about comebacks. They're addictive. Once you've turned one setback around, you start to see future failures differently. You stop fearing them so much because you know you can recover. Failure loses its sting when you've proved to yourself that it's just a chapter, not the final page. By the end of the war, I had experienced enough reversals to fill several volumes. But I'd also seen what happens when you refuse to stay down. You become the kind of person who's harder to beat, not because you never fall, but because you always rise. So when life knocks you flat, and it will, remember this: the fall isn't what defines you. The comeback does, and the sooner you decide to start building it, the sooner the next chapter begins. Using words to rally the spirit was never just about sounding poetic. It was about survival. During the war, speeches were as much a weapon as any tank or aircraft. The enemy wanted to crush our morale before they crushed our defenses, and I made it my mission to ensure they never succeeded at either. Now, don't let anyone tell you speeches just happen. Every line I delivered was weighed, tested, sometimes rewritten 3 or 4 times before it left my lips. Words can build bridges or burn them. In war, they can hold a country together or let it crumble. I knew which side I was on. One of my most remembered addresses was given right after the fall of France. Britain stood alone. The mood in Parliament was tense, and beyond those walls, in the homes and factories, it was worse. People were frightened, understandably so. Some voices whispered that maybe we should negotiate. I had to silence that doubt. Not with threats. Not with false promises, but with conviction so fierce it would lodge itself in the bones of every man, woman, and child who heard it. I stood up and said we would fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, fight in the fields and in the streets, fight in the hills. We would never surrender. Those words weren't poetry. They were a vow. And that vow didn't just reassure the nation. It reminded me why we had to keep going. The strange thing about giving a speech in a time of crisis is that you're speaking to multiple audiences at once. You're talking to your own people, to the enemy, to allies who are watching from afar, and if you're lucky, to the future. I always tried to imagine a young listener, maybe a boy or girl huddled in a bomb shelter, hearing my voice on the radio. I wanted them to believe they would see better days. Now here's where this applies outside of war. Whether you're leading a team, managing a project, or just trying to inspire your friends, the way you speak matters. Words can pull people forward or hold them back. You don't have to be a prime minister to give a speech that changes someone's life. You just have to speak with honesty, passion, and purpose. I made it a rule never to talk down to the public. People can smell condescension faster than smoke from a fire. Even when delivering bad news, I told the truth. I would say, yes, this is going to be hard. Yes, the road will be long. But together, we can make it through. That balance, acknowledging reality without surrendering hope, is something I believe every leader should learn. I remember one particular evening after a brutal week of bombing raids. Morale was dipping, and we needed a boost. The BBC invited me to speak live on the radio. I sat there with my notes, but halfway through I pushed them aside. I spoke from the heart. I told the people listening that I had walked their bombed streets, seen the ruins of their homes, and felt the same pain they did. But I also told them that I had seen their courage, their laughter amid the rubble, and their refusal to be beaten. The feedback from that broadcast was overwhelming. Not because I'd been clever or eloquent, but because I'd been real. The public doesn't want a perfect performance. They want a voice that understands their struggle and believes in their strength. And let's not forget, speeches weren't only for the home front. They were for our soldiers too. I made sure they heard not just orders, but encouragement. I wanted every pilot, sailor, and soldier to know they were part of something historic, something worth every ounce of effort. One of the great truths I discovered is that words have momentum. The right phrase can echo for days, weeks, even generations. "We shall never surrender" still turns up in classrooms, films, and political debates. Not because I said it, but because it captures something universal about the human spirit. For you, the takeaway is this: when you speak, whether it's to one person or 1 million, speak like it matters. Choose words that give people something to hold on to when the storm hits. If you do, you'll find your influence lasts far beyond the moment you close your mouth. By the end of the war, I delivered hundreds of speeches. Some were carefully planned, others born in the heat of urgency. But they all shared one thing: a belief that words could do more than describe reality. They could shape it. And if you believe in that, you'll find yourself rallying not just others, but yourself. Because in the darkest times, sometimes the right words are the only light we have. And if you're the one holding that light, you'd better shine it as far as it will go. Keeping faith in the future sounds simple, but when you're living through days when the future looks like a smudge on the horizon, it takes effort. And during the war, effort was all we had. I remember waking up some mornings to news so grim it could have crushed anyone's spirit. Entire neighborhoods flattened, key allies struggling to hold their ground, fresh losses in the field. Each headline was another hammer blow to the national mood. But I knew that if I let my own belief falter, it would ripple outward like cracks in glass. People can sense when a leader's hope is running dry, and when they do, it's game over. Faith in the future isn't about pretending the present isn't hard. It's about seeing beyond the hard to what might be built afterward. I often thought of the war not as an endless tunnel, but as a dark bridge we had to cross. The difference is, a tunnel might have no end, but a bridge always leads somewhere. That somewhere was what I kept my eyes on. One of my favorite ways to remind people of that was to talk about victory as if it were inevitable, not as wishful thinking, but as a fact waiting for its appointed day. In speeches, I'd use phrases like "when we win" instead of "if we win." That small change worked wonders. It shifted the conversation from survival to triumph, and people began to imagine what life would look like on the other side of the war. Of course, this didn't mean ignoring the struggle. There were nights when I'd pace the war rooms, staring at the maps, wondering if my optimism was a bit too stubborn. But then I'd think of the alternative: letting despair take the wheel. And I couldn't allow that. Not for me, not for Britain. Here's what I discovered. Hope is not passive, it's active. You have to feed it. You feed it with stories of past victories, with reminders of resilience, with examples of others who overcame odds that once seemed insurmountable. I shared tales of nations that had rebuilt after disasters, of leaders who had risen from defeat to glory. Every one of these stories was a brick in the road to the future I wanted people to see. You might find the same is true in your own life. Whether you're working through a long illness, grinding through years of study, or chasing a dream that feels miles away, your belief in that dream needs constant nourishment. The day you stop feeding it is the day it starts to fade. One particular evening stands out to me. The bombing raids had been relentless. The cabinet was tense, the generals exhausted. We gathered in the map room, and I could see it in their eyes. They needed something more than strategy. So I put the maps aside and spoke about what Britain would look like after the war. I painted a picture of rebuilt streets, children playing in the parks, ships returning to ports filled with goods, families reunited. You could feel the atmosphere shift. They were reminded not just of what we were fighting against, but of what we were fighting for. Keeping faith in the future also means refusing to let temporary circumstances define you. There were times in the war when our resources were stretched so thin it seemed absurd to think we could keep going. But I knew that if we defined ourselves by the scarcity of the moment, we'd never get to the abundance that could follow. So we acted like victors in waiting, proud, unbroken, certain that the future belonged to us. This mindset is contagious. Once you believe in the future, others around you start to believe too. And before long, that shared belief becomes a force stronger than any single obstacle. That's why I never hesitated to speak of the war's end, not even when it was years away. I wasn't predicting the future. I was helping to create it. By the time the war finally ended, I had learned that hope is not just something you carry for yourself. It's something you carry for others when they can't carry it themselves. That's the responsibility of leadership, yes, but it's also the responsibility of friendship, family, and community. Because there will be times when the people you care about can't see the light ahead. And in those moments, your faith in the future might be the only thing that helps them keep walking. So keep it bright, keep it steady, and never let it go out. Summary and conclusion. Looking back on those years, I realized that resilience isn't one skill, it's a collection of habits. Facing the Blitz head on taught me that you don't have to be fearless to act brave. Making hard choices when everyone's watching showed me the value of decisive leadership. Turning setbacks into comebacks proved that failure is rarely final unless you accept it as such. Using words to rally the spirit reminded me that communication isn't just about information, it's about inspiration. And keeping faith in the future demonstrated that hope is not a luxury, but a necessity. You don't need to be in a war to use these lessons. Your Blitz might be a personal crisis, a failed business, or a dream that's hit a wall. But the tools are the same. Act with courage, decide with clarity, rise after failure, speak with purpose, and never lose sight of the better days ahead. I've often said that success is stumbling from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. And I believe that still. If you can hold on to your conviction through the dark, you'll not only find your way to the light, you might just lead others there too. So, whether your battle is on the battlefield, in the boardroom, or in your own heart, remember, the future is built by those who refuse to surrender it.